Hello again, great to have your company on the Small Caps podcast. I'm Peter Capsanis. This year alone, amidst the global pandemic, Small Caps has continued to bring you some amazing stories about a growing number of ASX-listed companies emerging as pioneers in their field. We've seen it in the fintech and telehealth space, and now Incannex Healthcare Limited, or IHL, is no exception. The Melbourne-based biotech company is developing unique medicinal cannabis products for the treatment of obstructive sleep apnea, traumatic brain injury, and acute respiratory distress syndrome. Just think pneumonia, but even worse. So, the obvious question is, why cannabinoids, and why is IHL vesting an interest in these three areas of disease, so to speak? To tell us more, we're joined by the company's Chief Medical Officer, Dr Sud Agarwal. Sud, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Peter.
Let's start in a generic sense, Sud. There's more and more growing evidence about the healing powers of medicinal cannabis. Where does Incannex stand in this space? Is it a producer? Is it a retailer? Or rather, what's the path going forward for Incannex?
Sure. Well, if I start it by dividing the whole medicinal cannabis industry into three parts: upstream, midstream, and downstream. So upstream tends to be anything that's plant touching, and downstream tends to be anything that's patient touching, and anything in between is midstream that adds value to the whole process somewhere. So most people are very familiar with the companies participating in the upstream end. That's typically cultivators. There's many ASX-listed stocks and even many more on the Canadian stock exchanges who participate in that step. Similarly, there's quite a few companies who are at the patient end where they're prescribing or sourcing patients for medicinal cannabis companies to get their products to. Now, the midstream end is quite a unique part of the whole cannabis spectrum, and that tends to be people that are adding value to the chain in some way. So that may be that they're taking plant-based products and they're turning them into more sophisticated products by manufacturing, or it could be that they're doing research and adding value by delineating exactly which part of the whole cannabinoid chain group, which drug exactly in that works for which disease type. And that often involves a whole series of clinical trials and registration with some form of regulatory body. So Incannex is very much in that midstream section, and it's purely a cannabinoid biotech. So what that means is they've got some novel formulations. These are novel drugs which have never been discovered before, which are cannabinoid in their origins, and they've got secure intellectual property patents over them, and they are being researched for, in this case, a series of unique medical diseases which have no existing cures for.
So Incannex is running trials across the three areas of sleep apnea, traumatic brain injury, and acute respiratory distress syndrome. Let's hone in on obstructive sleep apnea. A lot of people can possibly relate to this. What is your trial looking at in this space particularly when you say there's no cures for?
Yeah, so moving to obstructive sleep apnea, I guess what's interesting about obstructive sleep apnea, or OSA, is that there's no medical treatment or pharmacotherapy available today. And the most conventional treatment that people use is the CPAP mask. So I guess it's a really good opportunity to disrupt what is effectively a multi-billion-dollar market globally. And whilst the CPAP mask appears to have very high efficacy, the problem with it is that compliance is poor, and then we find at the 12-month mark after people have started using it, around 50% of people have abandoned it because they can't tolerate the noise or the discomfort or the social issues associated with it. So we're right at the start of the clinical trial journey with obstructive sleep apnea, and we're literally on the doorstep of commencing a phase 2 trial at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, Victoria. And the purpose of this trial is to really show what is the effect size, so how efficacious is our treatment. This fixed dose combination of a cannabinoid and a non-cannabinoid that we've got fused together as a novel drug combination, really, what is the effect size we're generating? How effective is it at treating the apnea-hypopnea index? And is it superior to other products on the market? And also, is it is it as successful as the CPAP mask? And if the tolerability is much more improved, which is what we expect, and the efficacy is somewhere in the ballpark of the CPAP mask, it could be a serious contender to become the primary treatment for sleep apnea globally. So the actual trial that we're on the verge of commencing is a phase 2 trial, and results from this trial, should they be positive and should they give us the outcome that we're looking for, may result in quite a significant improvement in market valuation of that clinical asset. It's well recognized that clinical assets which have gone through phase 1 and 2 evaluation and are effectively ready for a pivotal phase 3 study have a very transferable asset value, which would probably attract the interests of big pharma or another company looking to commercialize a drug in this area. We wouldn't be surprised if existing manufacturers of CPAP masks themselves feel threatened enough to probably want to take a significant interest at that point.
Talk to me about the research in relation to SAARD. I did mention it in my intro, but to begin with, what does it stand for and just how dangerous is it?
Yeah, right. So SAARDS, which is SAARDS, is sepsis-associated adult respiratory distress syndrome. And it's like a common endpoint for many different infection-related diseases. And it's become of particular relevance of recent times because of COVID. So what happens is people have an infection from any source. This could be urinary infection, it could be a lung infection from a chest sepsis, it could even be from a skin infection. And their body has a significant inflammatory reaction to it. But for whatever reason, it's the inflammatory reaction to this that causes overwhelm in the body and eventually results in the patient having a significant respiratory complication such that they need intensive care treatment. Now, it sounds unusual, but with COVID, we're seeing that more and more. We're seeing a substantial number of young, middle-aged, older people who are developing this acute adult respiratory distress syndrome and requiring intensive care ventilation. Now, the mortality for ARDS from all comers is close to 50%. So if you do get it, it's not a very good outcome. Now, the idea is that between the time when somebody gets the infection and before their body develops their ARDS, if there was a certain drug that can be given some intervention, then you can prevent that onset. So the idea, from a COVID perspective, people get some high fever, cough. They're getting some nasty symptoms like a virus-related symptoms, and then there's often like this 2-week pause, and then a small number of people develop this immune system overwhelm, which results in a very significant decline and often a trip to the ICU. If there was a drug available between points 1 and 2 that could be given to them to stop that from happening, that would be the ideal situation. And that's where this drug comes in. It basically dampens the immune system in such a way that it won't dampen things so badly that it will cause the original infection to cause significant spread, but it will prevent the immune system in your body attacking your body heavily and resulting in the ARDS.
So right now with the onslaught of COVID, and we're seeing obviously that across, many parts of Victoria, this is something that you're probably looking into quite intently, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, we're trying to accelerate a lot of research on this. We've completed one animal trial, which had a very favorable outcome, showing that both the two constituent drugs of that, which is CBD, known as cannabidiol, which was shown to be very, very effective for reducing the significant inflammatory response to the body. And the animal study came back showing that the combination of the two components were significant reducers of inflammatory response in the body. So now we've moved on to a further study, which is showing that in the test tube or in vitro, that the drugs can be used to reduce the inflammatory response of the body. And then we expect within a short period of time, especially after we've got access to do clinical trials, that we can replicate these same results in humans too.
I've got to ask, could this be used for the common cold and flu, or say for pneumonia, or does it have to be for something so severe as SAARDS?
Yeah, look, it's probably a bit excessive for the common cold and pneumonia. The idea being that this is a drug that's only reserved for very, very significant infections. So it wouldn't make sense to use it for a very, very small, minor infection like a common cold.
There's another trial in another space, and that's in relation to traumatic brain injury and concussion, which I understand involves a bit of the MMA space as well. Can you elaborate on that for me?
Yes, so obviously traumatic brain injury is very, very significant, and it's a lot more common than you think. People would be very surprised if they knew how much injury is caused by it. So if we include all motor car accidents, motorbike accidents, sporting injuries, and any sort of significant head injury, there's about 10 million deaths annually, globally, because of it. So it's a very, very significant disease. And at the moment, there's no actual treatment for it. So if you have a significant head injury, the only real treatment available is supportive treatment. You'll get admitted to an intensive care unit, you might get intubated and ventilated, and you might just get some sedation to try and keep your body calm, but that's about it. There's no actual treatment available. Now, the general mechanism of injury to your body and the sort of deterioration that occurs after a head trauma is it's not actually the initial head trauma that causes the significant damage. It can be, but it's not usually the cause of a decline. What usually happens is your body detects bits of blood and inflammation around where the injured site is inside the skull, and that acts as a very powerful inflammatory source, causing lots of bloodstream, what we call acute phase proteins or white blood cells, to try and come and repair that part of the brain. And it's this sudden gush of inflammatory cells and white cells and the increased intracerebral pressure that causes a secondary damage to the brain, and that's what's of concern. So it's overexcitation of the brain, overinflammation inside the brain, reduction of blood flow in the brain because of all this increased pressure, and also this increase in oxygen utilization by the brain, which causes the brain to deteriorate. And it's that secondary brain injury that our drug is proposed to prevent.
What is the market like for Incannex? Obviously, you're not doing this just because you want to be good corporate citizens. What is the end goal here for Incannex?
Yeah, okay. Again, very good question, Peter. So, first of all the drugs that we picked them for a reason. And the most important reason is they're all unmet needs. There is no existing treatment for any of those three segments. So, it does mean that the FDA or the TGA or the EMA, whichever regulatory body we're applying through, gives them a special level of acceleration based on the fact that they're a significant disease of which there is no cure known to man today. Secondly, every one of them, they're actually a very significant disease. They've got a total addressable market in excess of $1 billion and also significant export potential because globally there's no solution for those problems. Now, thirdly, we've only picked disease categories where we think that there's already a substantial body of anecdotal evidence suggesting that cannabinoids can help with them. And I've already outlined that a little bit when we just spoke a few minutes ago about the individual disease segments. And fourthly, we've only picked diseases where we think there's an opportunity to accelerate the development with the FDA and reach that regulatory point, that new marketing approval or new drug approval in a short period of time, much shorter than the normal 5 to 10 years it would take for standard drug development.
So the vision and the strategy is to get FDA approval in the US. Why is that the focus? Why not TGA? Why FDA? Is it simply because of the market opportunity that the US provides?
Well, it's actually three things. So first of all, the market size in the US is bigger than any other market for pharmaceuticals. So that's absolutely the number one reason. Number two is there's already an FDA-approved cannabinoid. In fact, there's more than one. So Epidiolex is an FDA-approved CBD product. So that's very important. And number three, the FDA has a specific pathway called the FDA 505(b)(2) pathway, which allows you to bridge to existing approved drugs to get an accelerated pathway point. So it means you can leverage the data that's already been published about an existing drug with FDA approval, just do a bridge experiment to demonstrate bioequivalence to that drug, and then you can use that data. So because of that accelerated pathway, we can reach that end point of the FDA in a much shorter period of time than we could with other regulatory bodies. And that's the primary reason.
Okay, I see. So competing factors, hurdles, what stands in your way?
Right, okay. Well, so the roadmap generally for all new pharmaceutical drugs is non-clinical work, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then registration. That's your normal pathway. So at this point, we're trying to shore up the evidence to get to what's open up an IND, which is an investigational new drug portfolio with the FDA. And usually you need a whole bunch of evidence to give to the FDA, which demonstrates this is now safe for human use. So whilst we can say confidently that all the components of the drugs have both been used independently and safely used in humans, the combinations that we're proposing to use are quite novel. So at the moment, we're doing a variety of studies to demonstrate that the drugs can be used safely in combination, and that when they are used in combination, they work in such a manner that they're better than they would have been alone, and that they also are very efficacious, which means effective for treating what those underlying disease states are. So that's where we're at the moment. We're building a whole portfolio of evidence to open up an IND with the FDA.
Yeah, so the trials that you're holding at the moment, I mean, you're aiming, you're obviously going forward upon this IND approval, you'd be holding more trials in the process, I imagine.
Absolutely. So we're at different stages with the different drug candidates. Certainly, the sepsis-associated acute respiratory distress syndrome. We've done a whole variety of animal studies and in vitro studies, and these are sort of non-human studies. These are test tube animal studies which have shown good outcomes so far that we plan to use to open up an IND and access what's known as an emergency use authorization pathway with the FDA, because COVID is a disease considered so significant without any significant cure at the moment that we think we can get an super accelerated pathway to get FDA approval there. With obstructive sleep apnea, we've got a trial that's already being designed and submitted to the Alfred Hospital Ethics Committee, and that should be approved probably in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And with that, we hope to start our clinical trial, which is actually a proper clinical trial in humans for measuring sleep apnea's improvement with that drug combination. So slightly different stages with the different drug candidates there.
And what scope lies within the domestic market, the Australian market, Sud?
Yeah, look, again, very, very good point. So the Australian market already has something called a special access scheme. So once we've got enough confidence to be able to persuade physicians that these drugs are very safe and they're efficacious for their underlying disease, we'll plan to start both selling and marketing these drugs immediately through the special access scheme in Australia. So, and then once we have the FDA new drug approval, we'll apply for the same thing. Now, when you've already got FDA or when you've already got an approval with for marketing authorization in one jurisdiction, you can often apply for a very short pathway to get a mutual recognition in another jurisdiction. And generally, all the developed world countries have some form of accelerated mutual recognition pathway. So we wouldn't have to repeat all the studies or submit very lengthy portfolios of evidence again. We could simply leverage the information we've already submitted to the FDA to get into the European Union and also into Australia.
When we talk about cannabinoids, Sud, we're talking about obviously the elements that make up marijuana. What do you think the global view and perception of medicinal cannabis is now?
So if we look at countries that legalize medicinal cannabis way before Australia did, so if we look at the Canadian market or to certain states in the US, notably Colorado and California, in some of those places, medicinal cannabis or cannabinoids form 25 to 30% of all prescription drugs. That means they're now the number one prescribed drug. They prescribe them more than Lipitor or Atenolol, blood pressure and cholesterol drugs that are commonly used. So it really makes a huge dent into, prescribing habits for doctors. That's very important. And I think generally it's always been a stage by stage acceptance. So initially, everybody sees it as a drug that's from the recreational spectrum, what's it doing in the medical world, and then slowly as people get more comfortable with it, Then there's a few innovative doctors who are the early to prescribe type doctors. And then as they get comfortable with it and it shows that there are no patients getting harmed or minimal patients getting harmed, and there are improvements in certain disease types, then it just sort of blossoms from there. I think Australia's kind of at that point now where there's been a few thousand doctors who've prescribed it. It's really reached a relative point of comfort amongst most GPs now. I think there'd be very few doctors who wouldn't know at least one colleague who hasn't prescribed cannabis. That would be unusual. And then you've now got some doctors who've prescribed it, hundreds, if not thousands of times. So it's a really, really interesting place where we are now. I imagine, judging by the uptake of cannabis amongst Australian doctors that have happened over the last 2.5 years since legalization, I would imagine that if the rate of acceleration continues as it is at the moment, cannabis would be one of the top 5 prescribed drugs by 2022.
You're an anaesthetist by trade. Ever thought about using cannabinoids to put people to sleep before they go under?
Look, it's a really good question, and it's potentially a future use. I mean, I don't think cannabis alone is a powerful enough hypnotic to put people to sleep in its entirety by itself. I think in combination with other drugs, there is potentially a future there.
I think there'd be a few people listening who would disagree with you, Sud, but anyway.
Well, look, it'd be very interesting to know. But I think certainly it's been shown to be a very powerful anti-epileptic. So in the US, it's one of the most commonly used treatments for treating certain forms of pediatric epilepsy. And it's found to be very safe and very effective even in small children. Now, it's well known that the benzodiazepines had commonly been used for epilepsy as well prior to that. Now, the interesting thing is benzodiazepines often form part of a balanced anesthetic because they reduce amnesia, discomfort, and some of the anxiety associated with surgery. So there's possibly a role that cannabis could play in lieu of a benzodiazepine as being an alternative drug for that. So I hope one day that there is a cannabinoid in the shelf of that anesthetists have all the drugs available to them.
Well, it's definitely going to be an interesting space as we move forward, and we'll be watching with great interest as to how IHL goes in this space, and obviously pending the FDA approval. Dr. Sud Agarwal from Incannex Health Limited, thank you so much for your time today.